Our topic for today is spirituality and the two halves of life. Spirituality, the two halves of life. And it's the new work I'm trying to do in terms of spirituality, in terms of pushing the wedge a little further. Many of you have read the book, The Holy Longing. And you're going to see in many ways that spirituality for the first half of life. But let me try to situate this. See, I wrote the book, The Holy Longing, on an invitation from the religious editor at Doubleday. And he saw me and he said, look, write a book on spirituality, but I want this particular kind of book. He said, don't give me the survey course that you teach at university. Write a book that I can give to my adult children who no longer understand why I go to church or believe. He said that I can give to them which explains to my adult children why I still go to church and why I still believe. He said, and that I can read on those days when I'm not so sure why I'm going to church and why I believe. And so The Holy Longing was intended very much as really a fundamental book. What is spirituality? What is Christ? Why go to church? What is the Paschal Mystery? What is social justice? What is sexuality, and so on, and try to give some real fundamentals with that. In essence, it tries to describe essential discipleship, and you're going to see spirituality for the first half of life. This book is intended to get us to a certain place, but that's not home plate by a long shot yet. So I'm going to propose today that there's really three kinds of discipleship that Jesus calls us to and that the New Testament and our Christian tradition calls us to. There is essential discipleship, kind of as it's laid out in The Holy Longing. There's generative discipleship, the discipleship of the proficient we'll look at. And then there's still radical discipleship, which is discipleship of the second half of life. Now, during the first two blocks, we want to look at discipleship during the first half of life, which is going to be essential discipleship and generative discipleship. And it's captured in some ways, all of this, in the poem, The Holy Longing. I want to begin by reading you this poem. It's from the German poet Goethe. And you'll see in this poem there's going to be a certain transition. And I'll point it out to you as I read it. The Holy Longing. Goethe says, tell a wise person or keep silent, because the mass man will mock this right away. I praise what is truly alive and what longs to be burned to death. In the calm waters of the love nights, where you were begotten and where you have begotten, a strange feeling comes over you when you see the silent candle burning. And now you are no longer caught up in an obsession with darkness, but a desire for a higher love-making sweeps you upward. Distance does not make you falter. Now, arriving in magic, flying, and finally, insane for the light, you are a butterfly and you are gone. As long as you haven't experienced this, to die in this way and so to grow, you are still only a troubled guest on a dark planet. Notice he starts in this poem and he talks about the holy longing. We're going to look at that in a few minutes. Just the desire, the eros, just the soul energy that God puts into us that pushes us outward, 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 outward. You're going to see that's all first half of life. And hopefully it leads us to a place where we become a generative man, a generative woman. And a generative man or woman, as we'll define later on, is simply somebody who brings energy into a community. Brings energy into a room, energy into a church, as opposed to somebody who sucks energy out of a room or out of a community or out of a church or out of any place. Okay, so he talks about how the holy longing, it brings us to a certain point, and he says, and then what should happen, what can happen, is that a desire for a higher love-making. There's two kinds of love-making. He said, a desire for a higher love-making can sweep you upward, where you become insane for the light. It's a wonderful expression. To become insane for the light. That's going to be the title of the book following The Holy Longing. See, The Holy Longing is essential discipleship, But at a certain point, there's another discipleship which springs from insanity for the light. Let's talk about just a little image of insanity for the light. Got this story from John Shea, the theologian in Chicago. And he tells a story, he got this out of the diary of a doctor in Los Angeles. And this woman doctor tells a story. She said when she was a young child, and she worked as a candy striper. She was a junior in high school, working Saturday mornings as a candy striper because her mother was demanding this. And she said one Saturday morning she went to the senior citizens' home. There was an old woman in her 90s who was very non-communicative. This old woman is sitting on her bed, just looking out the window, and the young girl tries to make a conversation with this old woman who won't talk to her. And she said, the woman wouldn't talk to me, so I just sat my ritual hour, looked at my watch every so often, and finally, the hour was closing and it was time for her to go home, mercifully. So before she goes, she turns to the woman, she said, what were you looking at as you're looking outside the window? And the woman turned to her with a strange look on her face and said, dear, I was looking at the light. And this girl, writing this diary, she says, and the strange look on her face, I could never pinpoint what that look meant. Said, until I became a doctor. Said, and today I'm a gynecologist and I deliver babies. Said, when babies come out of the womb and they see the light for the first time, that's the look on their face. See, this woman, she was becoming insane for the light. You're going to see in some sense that's an image and a metaphor for spirituality truly for the second half of life. But during this session, I want to focus on spirituality for the first half of life and the concept of essential spirituality. After the break, we're going to focus more on what is generative spirituality. This is more on what is first level spirituality, essential discipleship, discipleship 101. And I want to begin with an image which I've taken from Kazantzakis, the great Greek writer, to divide the two halves of life. And Nikos Kazantzakis, the great Greek writer, remember he wrote the book Zorba the Greek. He wrote The Last Temptation of Christ. He was a wonderful, talented, gifted writer. But he grew up in this house, in this home in Crete, and he said, I grew up religiously schizophrenic. He said, because my mother was a very pious Orthodox Christian who went to church every day, who prayed a lot, lit vigil lights in church. He said, my dad was a hard, anti-cleric, anti-ecclesial man. And so he was caught between the piety and faith of his mother and between the rigidity and religious angers of his dad. And as a 19-year-old, he decided to explore this for himself. So he went to a monastery on Mount Athos for a summer. And he keeps a diary. And in the diary, he talks about the different conversations he had, the idealistic young 19-year-old with these old monks in the monastery. And one of the unique characters he met was an old Father Macarius in his 80s. And he has many conversations with this old man. And one day he's talking to old Father Macarius, and he says to the old priest, he says, now, Father, he said, you're 80-some years old. He said, do you still struggle with the devil? The old guy said, no. He said, to be honest, no. He said, I did when I was younger. He said, when I was younger, I wrestled with the devil. He said, but now I've grown old and tired, and the devil has grown old and tired with me. He said, I leave him alone, he leaves me alone. Okay? We've had our struggles, like two heavyweights who've had lots of fights, So the young Kazantzakis says to him, so your life is easy then? He said, oh no. He said, it's much harder now. He said, I used to wrestle with the devil. He said, but now I wrestle with God. That's much tougher. And the young man said, you wrestle with God and you hope to win. He said, no. When you wrestle with God, you hope to lose. But in some sense, that's a metaphorical image of the two halves of life. Very simplistically put, we spend the first half of our lives wrestling with the devil. And that's the struggle to attain essential spirituality, discipleship, and generative discipleship. But that doesn't take us home. Then we need to spend the second half of our lives, which won't be chronologically the second half of our lives. We need to spend a chunk of our lives wrestling with God, and that's the real struggle. That's the final struggle before we enter heaven. And that's going to be radical discipleship, the second half of life. So that's the way I want to break it up. We want to talk this morning about wrestling with the devil. What are our struggles with the devil, however you conceive of that force? Mythically, the first half of life is very, very much the struggle to come home. What do I mean by that? Simply this. You know, we leave home at puberty, even though we actually don't move out of the house for 3 or 4 or 5 more years. But really what happens is you're only home until puberty hits. You know, remember those early years? That's when you go on vacation with your family and your mother and father, and you like to go to grandma's on Sundays. And, you know, pre-puberty kids are a unique species, and they're wonderful. Then in the space of 1 summer, our hormones cut in, and you lose your children. They are gone, and we lose ourselves. And hormones literally drive us out of our homes, even though you live at home for a few more years. And then it's going to take 40 or 50 or 60 years to get back home again. You're going to see, and that's going to be really the struggle for essential discipleship. And then once we get back home again, that's going to be generative discipleship. But sometimes it can take you 40 or 50 years to get back home after your hormones have initially driven you out of the house the first time. That's the struggle of the first half of life. And poetically, that is the holy longing. That's what Goethe calls the holy longing. Now, let's look at that. I want to single in on 8 chaotic energies that are the key struggle in the first half of life. That there's really 8 major energies that, and they're, in fact, I hesitate to call them demonic because they're actually good. These energies come from God, but they're disquieting energies. They're energies that drive us beyond ourselves. They're energies that overpower us. They're energies, as you're going to see, that need to be put under a discipline. You know, see, so the word discipleship, you know, we're meant to be disciples. Notice the word disciple comes from discipline. To be a disciple is to put yourself under a discipline, okay? And you're going to see that we have these 8 powerful energies, and they need to be put under some kind of discipline so we can come home again. See, they kind of kick in with full force at puberty. You know, when we kind of come to, it's our second moment of our birth. See, when we're born, we know how to initiate kids in the crib, you know, and they come to the light the first time. But then at about 15 or 13 or 11, whenever puberty cuts in, a new kind of life bursts forth. And oftentimes, as a culture, we don't know how to initiate that energy anymore. We kind of hold our breath and hope our teenagers don't get killed before they grow up. Okay, now let's look at that energy, which might take 20, 30, or 40 years to initiate. Okay, the first one is, I call it Eros, the sheer pulse for life. You know, we are born, let me quote Plato. That's the way I begin the book, The Holy Longing. So Plato says, we are fired into life with a madness that comes from the gods. And this madness would have us believe that we can have a great embrace, or that we can perpetuate ourselves, make our own seed immortal, or that we can contemplate the divine. Now, it's a wonderful statement. Outside of explicit religious language, it's probably the highest anthropological statement I've read. See, notice what Plato says. First of all, the verb. He says, we're fired into life. Notice he doesn't say, we're born serenely. You wake up in your crib, contemplatively survey your options, you know. No, you wake up crying on fire with all kinds of desires and all kinds of needs, bodily and psychologically and so on. He said you wake up mad. There's a certain insanity inside of the human person. But notice he says, but it's a madness that comes from the gods. It's divine. As Christians, we say it's the image and likeness of God in us. See, the image and likeness of God is not some beautiful icon that's stamped inside of you like some beautiful Russian icon. You know, we say, I have the image and likeness of God inside of me. God is fire in Scripture. God is, you know, the Old Testament, that's the image. God is this great energy, this great fire. And see, so that this energy is godly. But see, what's godly is beyond us. You know, we can control what's human. Our energies are overpowering to us. You know, and see, so we live with this, and it's a sheer pulse for life. You see it in kids. For instance, you see it already in babies. Babies, as soon as they start to crawl, they want to inhale everything. They put everything into their mouth. Dirt, toys, electrical cords. You know, a baby wants to eat up the world. See, that's the pulse of energy. Then you get to be a teenager, and it bursts forth hormonally, and the teenager wants to just absorb all of life. They never want to sleep. Except when they go to sleep, they never want to get up again, you know, but they want to stay up all Friday night. They want to go from party to party to party to whatever. And you have all this energy. They want to watch everything on television, see every movie, absorb every rock concert, listen to every tape. See that there's this powerful energy just to, it's not to consume. Sometimes we put it simplistically, say it's well, we're consumeristic. No, this is divine energy. You know, God embraces the world. And that's why with young people, you can't have religion that is anyway is dead, because they need the color, the life, the energy. It's so strong in them. The sheer pulse for life. Secondly, sexuality, which is part of that. Our sexual energy, which is always there. It's already there when we're born, but it really constellates and becomes fixed and almost overpowering at puberty. And so it cuts in literally with a violence. Our sexual energy constellates with a certain violence when we're, you know, in puberty. I don't know how it is for women, but for instance, for boys, in the space of less than a year, he will suddenly have 300 times more testosterone in his system than he had the year before. Well, no small wonder he's biting the top off of Coke bottles, and he's trying to get in a fight, or, you know, and he doesn't know who he is anymore. His body is just heated up. And he's just, and he becomes awkward, and he starts acting out, and so on. Our sexual energies, they cut in with an incredible power when we're at puberty, and they're never going to let go again till we die. In fact, I'm not sure what happens after death. You're going to see they're going to change focus, and this afternoon we'll look at what happens in generative people, what happens with their sexuality, what happens with radical, the Mother Teresa's, with our sexual energy. Sexual energy doesn't go away. You know, your sexuality is going to give you some quiet about 3 days after you're dead. But until then, it's going to take different forms and different shapes, but it's always there, and it's always there as a color to your life, as a powerful color. And if we suppress it, it's going to come out in negative ways and all kinds of, but sexual energy it can't be denied. It's energy that comes from God. It's got to be handled, disciplined. And sexual energy, in all cultures, you know, in every culture, it's a huge problem. How do you discipline it? And how do you come to, and not just that we aren't acting out, but how do we come to rest? How do we come to ease with our sexual energies? You know, because they're meant in a certain way. Like, for instance, if I'm a woman and I'm 40 years old and I don't have a baby, well, I'm going against biology. How do I come to ease with that? I'm a celibate as a priest. How do I come to ease with my sexuality? How do I sleep at night, sleep alone as I don't have kids, and all of us, even in the best marriages and so on. There's so many aspects of our sexuality that are much, much bigger than we are, and they're not going to give us any rest. At a certain point when we become proficient, we kind of make peace with our sexuality. And we can sleep at night, we can stay inside of our commitments. Oftentimes as a young person, you can't sleep at night, and a lot of young people do not stay inside of their commitments and so on because their sexuality is just so overpowering. Okay, that's one of the huge struggles for the first half of life. Okay, then restlessness and our congenital insatiability. Karl Rahner, in an expression that only a convoluted German theologian, I'm one of them, okay, that's why I can say this, can come up with something that's so convoluted and brilliant as Rahner. Okay, so Rahner at one stage says, in the torment of the insufficiency of everything attainable, we ultimately learn that here in this life there is no finished symphony. It's a wonderful line. But as a young person, we want the ecstasy. We want the full symphony. We want life and love without shadow, without limit. And so we're driven out. And so oftentimes the struggle of the young person, first half of life, is frustration. I'm frustrated. My job isn't right, my marriage isn't right, my city isn't right, my body isn't right, society isn't right, the politics aren't right, the president isn't right. And see, so that there's this frustration where we take the perfect and crucify the good, where we can have a good life and never be inside of it. See, and so restlessness is such a powerful struggle during the first half of life, where it's so hard to get inside of our own skin. You know, we all have our own stories, where sometimes we have a pretty good life, except we're not inside of our lives at all. You know, I mean, we're going through the motions of our life, but in our daydream, in our fantasy, in our restlessness, we're elsewhere. It's, I'm stuck in this marriage, I'm stuck in this city, I'm stuck in this job, in this God-forsaken little town, working in safe ways and so on. It's all an unconscious restlessness, restlessness, restlessness. That our lives are never enough for us. And so part of the struggle of the first half of life, you're going to see it's also true for the second half of life, but it impacts differently, is how to make life enough. So coming to peace with this great energy is coming to peace with the fact that we never have the finished symphony. And then coupled with that is also loneliness. You know, as a young person, we are distanced from intimacy. You know, intimacy is something we grow into. Jung once said, you know, the perfect intimacy that you experience in this life is actually unconscious. You experience it in your mother's womb. In your mother's womb, you have perfect intimacy. And then we're born, and being born, birth is always traumatic for everybody. No matter how we do birth, birth is a massive trauma, which we don't quite ever recover from, or it takes 50 years to recover from being born. You know, George Carlin, the comedian, who can absolutely be brilliant sometimes. Carlin says once, he says, when I was born, I was so stunned I couldn't talk for 2 years. Okay. And see, birth is traumatic, you know. It takes us 50 years to recover from it because birth cuts us off. When we come out of our mother's womb and the umbilical cord is cut, humanly, we are set adrift. And then we're this lonely monad, you know, looking to connect. And that's the stereotype, which is also the archetype of the lonely teenager, you know, looking for somebody, somewhere to connect, somebody. We're cut off. And oftentimes it precisely takes us 40 or 50 years till we're comfortable again in intimacy. And you know, in a romantic culture, a culture with a high romantic ideal like our own, which partly is beautiful, but partly it's also torturous, you know. And what happens is, see, high romance isn't necessarily intimate. And sometimes we crucify ourselves with this romantic ideal, which is beautiful, oftentimes unattainable, but oftentimes also doesn't contain the intimacy we want. You know, if Romeo and Juliet had actually married each other, had lived long enough, they'd have probably been divorced in about 3 years, you know. I don't think it would have been a very good match, you know. And so that sometimes just that torrid, romantic, mixed in with sexual concepts we have, you know, which fire us and drive us out and energize us and so on, they don't necessarily make for intimacy. Intimacy is more rarely achieved. And that is why in our culture we have expressions. You've heard them. We have expressions like, it's easier to find a lover than a friend. You know, in our culture you can find a lover, but you can't necessarily find somebody to be intimate with. And that's even doubly hard when you're younger. You know, when you get to be our age and so on, middle age and beyond, proficiency, oftentimes it's not that hard to find a friend. You know, intimacy comes a little easier, even though we perhaps don't understand it. Now, next one, insubstantiality. One of the great struggles, and this is going to be a very important point, one of the great struggles in the first half of life and to achieve essential discipleship is with our own insubstantiality. What do I mean by that? I'm going to begin with kind of a humorous quote. Many of you are old enough to remember some years ago when Reggie Jackson was playing baseball. And I loved Reggie because not just that he was a great athlete. Reggie had a great sense of humor. And you know, the way Dean Martin used to spoof himself about being an alcoholic. Reggie used to spoof about himself as being an egotist. And one day Reggie said, it's really hard being Reggie Jackson. He said, because I have to deal with the magnitude of me. Okay. Okay. Now, humorously put, I say this because as a young person, it is the opposite that is always the case. During the first half of life, a deep struggle is to always deal with the insubstantiality of me. That as a young person, we don't have a self-identity. Maybe if we've been loved absolutely perfectly from the womb, and few people have, we have some sense of who we are. And so during the first half of life, a huge struggle and a huge part of becoming a disciple of Christ and to find our maturity as a man or as a woman is to find some type of self-identity, to find some type of healthy self-image, and to do that. And this is where spirituality for the second half of life, impacting the first half of life, can actually be dangerous. Give you an example of that. See, because as a young person, we need to actually do certain things, and we need to achieve certain things to feel good about ourselves, and God wants us to achieve certain things. That's the parable of the talents. We sometimes forget about the parable of the talents, where God gives us talents and needs and wants a return on those talents. But let me give you an example of what I mean. And I'll use myself as a bad example. Sincere, but bad, okay, in my preaching. Some years ago, when I was still living in Edmonton and teaching theology, and I preached a Sunday homily in a parish. And the text was the Mary Martha text. You're all familiar with the Mary Martha text. See, so Jesus comes to the house of Martha and Mary. Martha is busily doing all the housework, preparing the supper, and Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet. So Martha's not so amused by that. She comes to Jesus and said, doesn't it bother you that I'm doing all the work? Why didn't you tell her to do some of the work? And Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you're fretting about many things. Only one thing is required, and Mary has chosen the better part. Now, preaching on this text, I quoted what I considered some very safe and deep sources. I quoted Mother Teresa. I quoted Henri Nouwen, whom I consider the best spiritual writer in the last 60 years, and Jean Vanier, who I consider one of our living saints in our culture today. All of whom have written on this and have written and said, look, it's not important to achieve things. It's only important that we take our identity not from what we achieve, but from who we are. And Nouwen puts it so graphically. Nouwen says, if we start taking our identity from what we achieve, that becomes a cancer. You have to keep achieving and achieving, and we've all been there. If you do something good, you feel good about yourself. And then when you can't do something good, you don't feel good about yourself. If you look in the mirror and you have a perfect body and perfect hair and perfect teeth, you feel good. You look in the mirror and your hair and teeth aren't so good, you don't feel good about yourself. They say, well, it's got to be something deeper. And all three would say, we need to learn to take our identity from who we are. We're God's children, not from what we do. You don't take your identity from what you achieve. So I preached this. I'm standing at the back of church afterwards, and you always know when somebody wasn't impressed with your homily. So this man comes up and says, nice homily, Father. Oh, yeah, okay. He said, however, okay. He says, nice homily. However, I said, can I ask you something? I said, yeah. He said, the people you quoted, like Mother Teresa, Henri Nouwen, John Vanier, he said, I don't want to argue with them. Obviously, they're correct. He said, but have you ever wondered about this? They always say it's not important to achieve anything, but they're all high achievers. Mother Teresa stepping off the plane in Stockholm, she's just picked up the Nobel Prize, and she says, it's not important you achieve anything, Henri Nouwen has published 50 books, and he was sought after by every major university in the world, like Harvard couldn't keep him, Yale couldn't keep him, and so on. And so he's saying, it's not important you really achieve anything. Jean Vanier is a wonderful man, but, has achieved a lot in his life. And these are people who are constantly stepping away from achievements. You're going to see, because they are great saints. They're in the second half of life. And they say, it's not important to achieve anything. He says, that's fine for them to say, but what about me? If I'm a big, fat nobody, unknown, he says, where do I get my self-image? Where do I feel good about myself? It's a good point. See, during the first half of life, success can teach you something. And you're meant to succeed at certain things. As I want to say this afternoon, quoting Richard Rohr, during the second half of life, success doesn't teach you anything anymore. And success can be a stumbling block for the kingdom. During the first half of life, not at all. And that's why it's dangerous to try to feed the spirituality of Mother Teresa just without qualification to the 20-year-olds. You know, Mother Teresa died when she was in her high 70s, and she had achieved a lot of things. You know, when you get to a certain point, then achievement stops being important. It starts being a hindrance. But during the first half of life, God gave us talents. And if you have artistic talents, you need to paint or write. If you have talent with your hands, you need to start carving some wood. If you have talent, whatever, you need to employ those talents and so on. And during the first half of life, success does teach us something. And it does. Sure, granted, it's a shaky self-image. It doesn't make us substantial, but it helps to teach us our substantiality inside of God. And see, so that the way we preach to a 20-year-old and the way we preach to a 60-year-old can be very, very different. You know, to a 20-year-old, if I'm their spiritual director, I'm going to say, go out, do something. You know, do some things that are successful. With a 60-year-old, I might say, it's time to shut it down. It's time to stop. Success is just, it feels real good. It's like a drug. Success feels real good after 60, but it doesn't teach you anything anymore. At 20, it not only feels good, it also can teach you some things, and so on. Granted, it can also be dangerous. It can lead to distorted self-image and so on, but God apparently wants us to risk that, and that's why Jesus gave us the parable of the talents. See, so during the first half of life, one of the great struggles is with our insubstantiality. Who am I? What do I mean? How can my life have an impact on this planet? Nobody wants to die and have never been known and be in an unmarked grave. We want to have some kind of mark and so on. And when we're young, it's a big struggle. Then, the sixth thing, our temptations. Temptations during the first half of life are largely temptations towards pleasure, comfort, affluence, and power. And that's not bad. These things can be bad, but just to recognize during the first half of life, if we're firing on all cylinders, if we're not clinically depressed, and we're honest, we are all tempted towards pleasure, comfort, affluence, and power. And don't be fooled by people who look like they aren't. Again, another story. Some years ago, I was a spiritual director at a seminary. I was teaching at the seminary, but a spiritual director. We had a young man. He was about 22 years old. Was a seminarian, and on the surface, he looked like Mother Teresa. He seemingly had no needs. He was deeply committed to a simple lifestyle. I think he even stopped eating meat, as a sign that he's not going to impact the planet. He spent a lot of time in chapel. He was deeply committed to justice. He refused to drink any liquor, no beer, no wine, wouldn't go to movies with the guys, So he's 23 years old, and he's already Mother Teresa, and a nice enough lad. A nice enough lad. I mean, it wasn't like he was on an ego trip or something. And he seemed to have no needs. His only need was to serve God and to serve the world in justice. Now, what can be wrong with that? Well, this is what's wrong with it. He was also depressive. When he walked into a room or sat down at a table, he sucked the energy right out of the room. Nobody wanted to be around him. You had this saint that just, he wasn't generating any life. He was draining life away. Nobody wanted to be around this guy. He went to a counselor, and a good counselor, and the counselor pointed out to him, you're depressed. And eventually, he got some therapy. He left the order. Today, he's a happily married, energetic father of 3 kids. And when he enters the room today, he brings some energy into the room. And now he drinks some wine, and he's kind of a happy 30-year-old, and so on. See, the difference between him and Mother Teresa is this. When Mother Teresa entered a room, there was powerful energy in the room. She didn't take energy out of a room. You ever walked in a room where Mother Teresa's there, it was like turning on another heater and a few extra electric light bulbs, Comes in the room, the thermostat goes up. There's high, powerful energy. See, when a saint enters a room, there's energy. It's not. If you are a normal, healthy person, you are going to have strong temptations towards these things. Pleasure, comfort, affluence, power, and so on. And that's a sign that you are healthy. Okay, now we got to put ourselves under discipline, not act out on all of this. But the fact that you want it. You say, God, I'd like to drink all the scotch in the world, I'd like to go to Las Vegas and gamble $10 million, I'd like to have sex with half the world. I'd like to, be power and be famous and be on Oprah every night. Doesn't mean you're going to do these things, but it shows that you're not in clinical depression. You're firing on all cylinders. The energy that God put inside of you, that you have still some divine madness that's awake. And during the first half of life, oftentimes it's that clear. That's why the parable of the prodigal son, he goes out and he squanders it on prostitutes and high living and booze and so on. That's the struggle of youth. Okay, then an inchoate desire for moral rectitude. During the first half of life, basically what this means is what's really important for us is that we're right. We can't give up our right and our need to be right. And that is why everybody has a cause. No matter what our morality is, everybody has some cause that they're willing to put literally their lives on the table for, and so on. I remember seeing a great cartoon once in a Dagwood cartoon. And Dagwood is going to work, and he sees this man standing with a sign, a placard, which says, "Save the high-rise apartment." So Dagwood went over and he says, "Save the high-rise apartment." He said, "What kind of cause is that?" The guy said, "I know it's not much, but all the good causes are already taken." Okay. Okay. See, and that's the political correctness of the right and of the left. See, you see that all the time today. You can't sneeze, and somebody is accusing you of being this or that, and the right has all its political correctness and its prescribed indignations and its moral rectitudes. The left has all its political correctness, all its prescribed indignations, all what you can eat and sneeze and think and so on. See, that's first half of life stuff, where law. Walter Brueggemann, the great writer, says, we get caught up in law. And even though the liberals don't think they're doing it just as bad as the conservatives and so on. And that is, it's always, we gotta be right. Got to be right, got to be right. You're going to see during the second half of life, that's one of the things we need to let go of. See, wisdom. See, you see in Scripture, you move from law to prophecy. And prophecy is still pretty confrontational. You move from law to prophecy to wisdom. Once you're wise, you don't need to be right anymore. See, and wisdom is symbolized by gray hair. So all of you in the room here with gray hair, we don't need to be right anymore. It doesn't matter who's right at a certain point. That's what Jesus is saying with that wonderful gesture at the Last Supper, in John's Gospel, where John replaces the Eucharist with the washing of the feet, where Jesus is saying, give up your need to be right. It doesn't matter who's right. It matters a whole lot whether we can serve and be with each other in community, and so on. And see, but during the first half of life, a big struggle is moral rectitude, because we're moral beings. I got to be right, I got to be right, I got to be right, I got to be right. And then lastly, I call it inchoate nostalgia to come home, the need for moral companionship, to be quiet, for solitude. Very important. Well, moral loneliness that's the desire not to have a lover to sleep with sexually, or even an intellectual companion. That's precisely the desire for a soul mate. And a soul mate is beyond sexuality. It's beyond psychology. You want somebody who meets you where all your values are, where what's deepest, what's truest, where you meet this person. And see, that's where also you have a sense of, I'm home. See, as little kids, we kind of get that in our parents, and we have a family, and your little child and your mom and dad are God for you as a little kid. And then our hormones cut in, and they send us out of the house, okay? And then part of coming home, part of that, the first half of life is going to take 30, 40, 50, or 60 years, is also to find moral companionship, where at a certain point you're at ease with somebody. You're at ease with a group, You're at home. Somebody is sleeping with you in terms of what's all that's deepest and important to you. Sometimes we go through life and we never find this. But part of the struggle of the first half of life is to find this, because it's precisely when we find it, oftentimes, that we are then empowered to be generative. Because then we don't have to be focused on ourselves. Our life is no longer about me. It's precisely when I found intimacy and moral intimacy and so on that I have the strength to move out and start trying to take care of the world rather than simply to try to take care of myself. And see, those are the 8 energies that we need to struggle with during the first half of our lives. And like I said, the first half of life can take 30, 40, 50 years after puberty, because the first half of life kind of starts really spiritually at puberty. And it might take us 30, 40, or 50 years to come back home, to somehow put all those wonderful, godly, but chaotic, overpowering energies, to put them under a discipline, under a discipleship, to achieve essential discipleship, which then makes us a proficient or a generative apostle.